So, Mr. Joel Greene, here we are. We're back. Pleasure to see
Yes,
you
we made
again.
it
This
happen.
time, this time with
Yep.
all your podcasting gear, your new mic. Uh, yeah, looks good. Looks like we're ready to go this time.
Yes, we are. Yeah. Yeah. After a couple of aborted attempts.
Well, last time we spoke, you had sort of diagnosed me my personality type, the MBTI personality type as an INTJ, and I did some more research, discovered I am in fact an INTJ-A, the assertive type. Then I did the Enneagram test. I'm a three-wing two, all that good stuff. Also, link to the show notes for anyone that's interested. But I made
Yep.
a really particular discovery, and that's that my girlfriend is an ENTJ. And actually, we looked into this. There's a website. It's called 16personalities.com. I believe it's what it's called, or .org. I'm not sure. But what we discovered is that if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see like celebrities and public figures that have your personality type, that share your personality type. And it turns out that Michelle Obama is an INTJ like myself. Barack Obama is an ENTJ, and they're a power couple, right? And then you've got Walter White from Breaking Bad, who's an INTJ, and then his wife is an ENTJ. And so we found these two power couples, and then we just like looked at each other and we're like, "This is perfect."
Yeah.
and
It's
uh,
it's
and
just about the perfect fit.
yeah, and you were just telling me that you are in fact an ENTJ. So maybe we can start there.
Yes.
If you can tell folks a little more about what that means and how it's useful.
Yeah. So those of you that many of you are probably really familiar with the MBTI, but for those of you that aren't, it's essentially a mapping of personality types based on things that are actually, if you think about them, they're fairly easy to quantify. So the simplest mapping would be extroversion versus introversion, and it's a little bit of a it's not so much about your gregariousness, it's more about how you recharge. So typically, like, extroverts get their energy from people and introverts will get their energy from being alone time, but both can go both ways. And then the next is intuition versus sensory. So, like, basically, do you really rely on intuition, or do you rely more on what you can sense, what you can see? And then there's thinking versus feeling. Do you tend to be like a, somebody who makes a pros and cons column, or do you tend to be like a gut feeling? And then decisions, like, do you tend to want to have your decisions done and off your plate, or do you want to leave your options open? So those are kind of like the broad categories, and then we're all have little bits of different aspects of those, but most of us kind of dominate in one sphere or another. And then across life, you can change a little bit, but generally, kind of the typing holds. What I've found is that it's extremely useful in business, very useful in business, because the typings hold very true. And once you've done it long enough, it takes you about 20 seconds, and you can read someone, and it's usually pretty accurate. So I'm an ENTJ, which is extroverted intuition thinking, and your ENTJs definitely fit a distinct type. They're very fun to be around. They're very much talkers. You typically find them involved in somewhere where they have to share ideas. They love to share ideas, and they love the big ideas, and they love, they're not that concerned with. They like to delegate the execution. And so, like, yeah, your Barack Obama is one, your George Clooney is another, your um, thinking of like a Rush Limbaugh or an Alex Jones. Those are ENTJs. So very much their idea people, and they're very good at speaking usually. And then their perfect match usually is the INTJ, which is called the mastermind, quote unquote. So the INTJs, they're very tactical, and they're very good at creating and solving problems, like creating new things, new solutions to problems. They think outside. Both the NTJs, the NTs in general, think outside the box. And
They call them the architects, right?
yeah, yeah. And their best matchup typically is going to be someone who has that N, who has the N, the intuition, because then what you'll hear a lot in conversation with two N's is interesting, fascinating. Yes, I was thinking about. So they have extroverted ideation. Their ideas they have to get out of their head, and that's not most people have introverted ideation. They keep their ideas in their head. So the typologies they're fun, they're interesting. They can be scary accurate at times. Yeah, I find them very useful. So
Yeah, it's been real cool going down that rabbit hole and
Yeah.
seeing my strengths and weaknesses like right before my eyes. You know,
Hmm.
it kind of puts you on the spot when you're reading through it, and you know that that's your personality type. You know, for example, like I've always expressed to my girlfriend, because she's very familiar with, you know, the nature of my business and what I do and how I accomplish what I set out to accomplish. And I've always told her, like, you know, it's all strategy. Like, I'm always thinking so many steps ahead, and I think that it really helps me cover my ass in so many situations. And reading this, it just made perfect sense. But then actually, you know, you have your strengths and you have your weaknesses too, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
if we look at some of the weaknesses of an INTJ in my case, you know, we can be perfectionists, we can be very competitive. Sometimes we can be unintentionally manipulative. And I think that comes with having a strategy that just makes sense to you, and you almost disregard emotions for logic.
Right.
Anyway, I recommend anybody tuning in definitely check that out. We'll link to it in the show notes. Thank you for taking us through such a thorough description. And let me ask you this. Let's piggyback off of the personality types. How do you feel that this has been useful to you in your business, in your career? How do you apply this knowledge?
Well, it's useful in a lot of ways. One, probably the principle is it gives you a sense, what I would call more of an internal confirmation for like what you're quote unquote destined to do. Like you really do kind of have a shape. You really do have kind of like, predilections and things that you're, you know, innately tuned for, innately wired for. And so once you kind of understand those typologies and the personalities that go with them, usually they give you a fairly good reading of what those types where you tend to find them. And it pretty much, it's not like it's telling you what you're going to be good at. It's kind of more or less confirming what you already knew that you were good at. And so I think it's very useful in sort of helping you find your lane and helping you cement like kind of the things that you should do and the things you shouldn't do. Like as an ENTJ, really the main thing for me is ideas and getting ideas out into the world and big plans and executing at the highest level to make big changes to things. And that's kind of what I've done. Like I'm kind of getting to the culmination of about 16 years of effort with what I'm doing in nutrition, which was to solve one problem, which is the biggest problem possible. And that's an ENTJ thing. It's okay. Like ignore the minors, go right after the very biggest thing. Elon Musk is an ENTJ. Go after the very biggest thing and then delegate everything. Like in my case, like where I'm going to get into the weeds and get in trouble is if I'm doing the delegation. That's where this particular personality type just gets in trouble, because they're much better at the sort of like big picture than they are the execution. They can do the execution. It doesn't come from the core of who you are. And so you're always draining yourself to do that side of things. And so, what it'll tell you is like, the things that you're really good at are not draining to you. They're things you really get energized by. And then other aspects of the business, things that are draining to you, those are just things other people are better suited for. Like my wife and I have this ongoing like laugh about the ISTJ personality, which is like as far from me as you could get. And they can be very difficult for this particular personality set to deal with, because they just, they're just exactly the opposite, but they're hugely necessary. Like you find them when you need certain like areas of business done. They're the perfect fit for that. And, that's like, oh, I need an ISTJ for that.
They're more of like the doers and the thinkers, you mean?
Not so much the thinkers. They're the ones who will
No, they're
execute.
more doers than thinkers.
Yeah,
They're
yeah, yeah. They
more
will.
focused on the execution rather than the actual fundamental plan or strategy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. They'll go and they love to check those boxes off, and gives them a sense of accomplishment, knocking them down. Where to me that's just
Yeah.
like, to me that's irrelevant. It's like it's relevant, but it's not. Let's focus on the big thing. And so, and it also helps you a lot in business dealings. So when you quickly learn to recognize like personality types, like you understand like an ISTJ is going to hear like something I'm saying and think of it as just some big schmaltzy sales pitch. It's going to turn them off. So you kind of learn how to position yourself to personality types, not to change who you are, but just to tailor whatever you're saying or doing to the type. So yeah, I found it's very, very useful. It's very applicable, surprisingly so.
Well, I definitely want to take this as an invitation again to anyone tuning in. You know, make sure to check out 16 Personalities. This is not, you know, sponsorship or anything. It's just
Right.
genuinely, it ties into the concept of what we're trying to accomplish with this podcast, right? It's knowing your physiology, and all this is deeply rooted in psychology and sociology and such. So we do invite you to check it out. So let's back up before we get into the business end of things and what you're accomplishing in your field. You know, after 16 years of hard work, what you've accomplished and what you look forward to accomplishing. Can we back up and can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing? Because I know that it wasn't like you grew up with success all around you and accomplishment all around you. You had a
Yeah.
rough upbringing, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering how that challenge has helped you develop this endurance today. So if you can tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
what that was like.
Yeah, yeah, sure. It's most people are usually pretty surprised to hear that about me. Like, they think I'm just some spoiled kid or something. And no, I spent the first 7 years of my life in a black ghetto. Like, we were the only white family living in a black housing project, and we were poor. I mean, my mom was, just basically a poor Spanish, had no, skill sets really other than house cleaning. And, she had three boys. One of them had Down syndrome, a single mom. And, we used to have, I mean, by the time I was 7, I had seen, my mom nearly beaten to death in front of me in the street. We used to have roving gangs kicking our door open. We didn't have a phone. Didn't have food a lot. Yeah, I really was kind of way behind the starting line. All the things that you grow up with thinking are just normal, like furniture and food and a car and a phone. We didn't have any of that stuff. We were just poor, just like super poor. We moved around a lot, and then I got somewhat stable by about the time I got to high school. I managed to go to the same high school, all 4 years. But I didn't have any, like, one of the things when you come from that background is you're missing all of the day-to-day coaching that a parent will put into place with a child. For example, my niece just got a job in Silicon Valley. She had me coaching her every step of the way. Like, okay, it's a startup. Here's what you're going to expect. You're going to be working crazy hours. They're going to push you. I want you to prepare yourself for that. Okay. When you negotiate for this, do that. There was all this coaching. I didn't have any of that. So I just, what I had was, I, for whatever the reason, developed pretty quickly intellectually, like as a kid. So I started reading like at about 3. And then I just read voraciously. I read everything I could get my hands on. And so I was reading, novels by first, second grade and comic books. And I kind of grew up in that world. So I kind of just really grew up, just reading a ton. And it probably saved me in a lot of ways because books are ideas. And I was exposed to so many ideas and ways of thinking because I read so much so early on that I think it had a big influence on me. Like it probably, I mean, I should be dead or, a lot of other not so great things, but yeah. So, and then I was also really into athletics growing up too. So, my mom, like, really, the one thing she understood was, like, when you're in the ghetto, the way out is athletics. So I was a really skinny kid. So I got into like running and track and field. And in the 5th grade, like, I used to just go to the blacktop every day in the summer and just do sprints, trying to get faster because I wanted to be fast. I didn't, and that was one of those things where it just kind of was always there. So I was really into athletics at an early age, and just always like walking around on my hands doing, gymnastics, and I started lifting weights like in 4th grade. We had no weights, so I took a hammock that we had, and I just tore it apart and started working out with that, and started, going to the gym, doing Olympic lifts at 12, 13. So that was kind of my world. I wasn't really like academically strong. I didn't have anything, kind of behind me there. I was always bright. Like, I would test like pretty well, anything that had to do with language, I tested really, really well. Like, always like probably top 1 or top 2 people in any class. And then I was horrible in math. Like, I was like really behind the curve. And ironically, what happened to me was, at one point I just sort of realized like that, I wasn't controlling my focus, and that had been my problem all these years. And I saw math as a language, and I just suddenly the lights went on. And then within a year I was tutoring calculus. And I was fortunate enough, though, I think in high school I grew up in San Jose, for my high school years. And I was fortunate enough to have friends who were, their parents were in the professional class. So they were like, attorneys. My girlfriend in high school, her dad was an attorney, and I was around all this stuff. And so I kind of sponged as much as I could get from that. And, I developed some goals early on, like I was going to go to college, and I was going to go to a UC, not the regular state school, but a UC, and I was going to figure a way to do that. So I didn't have a way to pay for college. So I wound up taking this summer job selling books door to door, where you worked 80 hours a week on straight commission, 6 days a week. You'd start knocking on doors at 8 in the morning, finish up 9, 10 at night, and they would send you like to, Nashville for a week of training. And then they would send you to some obscure town in the middle of nowhere where there's nothing to do but work. So like my first summer, I worked in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and it was just like a dying mill town, and, just worked my butt off, and I did okay. I was really overcoming a lot of things in life. And what helped me a lot was, I remember the very first door I ever knocked on, this guy just screamed at me and slammed the door in my face. And then I went into this thing of like, I'm not going to be able to do this. And then, like in a microsecond, then I won't be able to pay for college. Then I won't have it, and then I'm not going to, and I just got like really determined, and I just, and I pushed, and I just started running to the next door and just ran the whole day, and I wound up doing great. I made like a bunch of money that day. And so I think for me, what helped a lot was because I had had so many hard times growing up that things that were really hard typically didn't bother me. Like I had a lot of resilience, a lot of endurance, and that kind of like, that was something that I think just, you can't really, maybe you can teach it. I don't know. I learned it the hard way, and just the ability to, whatever's happening to, problem solve and to look for solutions and look for a way out and all that. And that was kind of like a big part of like, me growing up. Typically one of the things you take for granted, particularly in this age, is that parents are very affirming, it's the, you're awesome generation. I didn't have any of that. We had the exact opposite of that. And it was like, my mom was dealing with a lot of mental illness, and it was crazy. And so, my self-concept started from like, didn't start at the line. It started at miles in back of the line. I had to like really just overcome a lot of things by just achieving and by doing, and by like, I went from thinking I couldn't do one thing to being able to excel at it. And that really shaped me a lot, I think, because somewhere along the way, what I figured out was that I could master any idea. There wasn't any idea I couldn't master if I applied myself to it. It didn't matter what it was. And I also, along the way, kind of just placing blind trust in authority figures to, pretty much the same thing would happen a lot of the time, where I would I would just start to learn what that authority figure knew, and then I would learn it as good as them, sometimes better. And I'd realize they kind of know some things and don't really have it all figured out. And so I learned to think for myself and learn to rely on my own conclusions a lot. And that's a thing that's very different, I think, from what you find nowadays. I don't really buy into anything that's official. I just like to do my own research and form my own conclusions, and usually takes me to a place that's the opposite of what the common belief about any given thing would be. But I think it's just that ability to believe in yourself that you can master any idea, any subject, any piece of, there's nothing I'm afraid of. I'm not afraid of like quantum physics. I'm not afraid of particle physics. I'm not afraid of, stochastics. I'm not afraid of any of those things, because I just know that I just need to apply myself a couple hours a day and I can master that,
So it's like that deficit in terms of judgment and wisdom early on in life taught you to rely on yourself and to learn directly from sources that had been refined, that had been looked over, that had been mastered. And so you carry this with you from an early age, and you get to the point now where you look to master these things yourself and to gain the knowledge yourself and disregard the authority. And so would you say it's that deficit early on that has carried you through? Is it the reason why you feel so motivated to learn these things on your own?
I just evolved eventually to this place of inventorying whatever somebody's saying, and okay, I'll inventory that, I'll take a look at it, but pretty much knowing that if I dive into that myself, that I'm going to come to my own conclusions on it. And very often, they're they're the opposite of what you might think on a given subject. And yeah, so I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, that's just, I just kind of how I came. So with what I do, in the world of, that I'm in, people will ask me a lot, like, well, how'd you get all this? Where'd you learn all this? And it was just really out of necessity. Like, I never saw myself as, like, some information source. I just really saw myself as a consumer who is consuming information from experts. And then I would do that. And then later on, I'd get 5, 6 years down the road and realize that guy didn't know what he was really talking about. Because I'm really hurting now from doing that thing that he told me to do, it didn't work. And so I just, particularly in this endeavor, began to really like dive into doing the research myself, and just not even reading books, but just going to what the papers say, and I've always been a really good reader, so I had the ability to just digest massive amounts of like science garble very fast, and so that was like for me something I think that helped a lot, and it's helped me. I think in terms of what I've done with all this stuff that I'm doing, for sure. So.
And as far as dealing with the weaknesses that any personality has,
Mm-hmm.
how have you dealt with those?
Oh gosh, mostly just a lot of stumbling and bumbling. I'll tell you, like, when you're young, you go through an interesting arc where you're really trying to prove things to yourself. You're trying to prove that you're smart, or you're the smartest guy in the room, or you're capable, or you're this or you're that. And then, once you've lived long enough, you realize like you kind of suck at a lot of things, and you're good at it. You're good at it's like that personal illusion. I don't need to maintain that at all anymore. Like I don't need to think that I'm this or I'm that, or I'm good at this or I'm good at that. That's not in my wherewithal anymore. It's more like the older I get, I realize I'm good at a very few things, maybe even fewer than I realized. And then everything else is just purely providence. It's purely like realizing I'm pretty inept at a lot of these things, and God, I need your help, and just relying on God a lot. That's been a big part of it for me, and it works. It works every time.
Relying on God.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's, if I can quickly jump in, I just want to describe an experience, and I'd love to get your take. The other day, I decided it'd be fun to. I don't typically drink alcohol, and when I do, it's red wine. I was at a restaurant. I had 3 glasses of wine. I felt really good, and
Yeah.
I was like, why don't I go ahead and tell my Instagram community, start asking me questions? And someone asked me what I think about God and the universe and such. And I don't want to go too far down the tribal hook because we could spend hours talking about this, but essentially what it came down to was this woman reached out and she gave me her take on my opinion, which was, apparently very egocentric. It's like, you do the right things will come to you, God and the universe will take care of you. And she told me, no, it's more about what you do, how it impacts others, and collectively, how we serve a greater purpose, God, Jesus, etc. Then I told her, hey, you know what? Why don't we set up a conversation? She told me a little bit about the Holy Spirit and God. And by the way, I was raised primarily Jewish. I'm Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so anyway, there was all these ideas that we were sort of going back and forth about, and I was able to gain somewhat of an understanding of what she meant by this collective experience. And that leads me to this question. You say God has taken care of you. How do you think your work has helped take care of more people,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you think that has impacted you? And if I may, let's put it this way. You describe how, you're the guy coming up with the ideas, right? You're behind the
Mm-hmm.
scenes coming up with these ideas. How do you think your ideas have served you,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you think the positive reinforcement from those ideas has really helped you sort of continue on this path of, massive success throughout the years?
Um,
How do they feed you?
mm, I mean, like when I look at for those of you not familiar, I wrote this book. It's called The Immunity Code. When I look at that book, and like I even now I'll go back and pour through it, and I'm like this thing is beyond genius. Like there's levels to this thing here I never saw, didn't even see until now, and like it's like I wrote it, but I didn't like it.
I know exactly what you're
Yeah, like it
describing.
didn't come, like it came from God. Like there's a genius there that's so deep and hits so many levels, I couldn't have come up with it. Meaning, like okay, me, the person in my brain, came up with it, but the program running in my brain was like, a download. Okay, let's put it that way.
Okay, you're giving me goosebumps. I just had a conversation about this with Dr. David
Yeah,
Rabin. He's the chief science officer of Apollo. I'm sure you're
yeah,
familiar. And we talked about how it's like you're able to channel in this energy, these downloads, when you take care of yourself, you're on a purpose-driven
yeah,
path, and you get this insight. Like the words come from nowhere seemingly, and they come down, and pen hits paper, and you're just like channeling this energy. I meant to interrupt because I
yeah.
want to ask you, what does it take for you personally to channel this kind of energy and this kind of genius? What are some habits that you enable that help you get there?
Well, I think number one is humility. Like, it's a hard place, I think, for most people in this day and age to get to, which is to come to a position where you really appreciate. And I'll only speak for myself, but that on my own I can't do very much. You know, like I can check all the boxes. I can have all the right slogans and do all the right things and take massive action and do all the Tony Robbins stuff. But like on my own, it's not going to bear a lot of fruit. It just isn't. And the way you know that is when you're doing something and you're just grinding away at it, but it's not bearing fruit over time, then the best way to put it is there's no favor on what you're doing. Okay. And you can do everything you think is right. You can check all the boxes, you can manifest, you can do all that junk. It's not going to have favor. So I think that when you're in a place where you kind of answered the most basic question in life, the number one fundamental question, which is who's in charge. Okay, that's the first question that has to be answered in life because it dictates your life. Who's in charge? So the way you answer that question will dictate your existence. If you think that you're in charge, then you'll paper your existence based on that idea. If you think God's in charge, then suddenly like if he's in charge and that makes me his property, and so everything comes from that. So I'm really just asking for direction. I'm asking for help. I'm asking for favor. I'm asking for not my will but his. All those things start to come into play, and that gets in the way for a lot of people. It gets in the way of me being in charge. And so that's why the number one thing is humility, because humility is I'm not really in charge. I'm not actually in charge. God's in charge. It's his stuff. It's his planet. It's his everything. And so, okay, it changes the equation completely. So I think that's a big piece of it. And then it's really just focus, like massive focus. Like I've always had a really good ability to focus, like to kind of get into a place where literally a glass could shatter in the room and I wouldn't hear it because I'm so focused on what I'm doing. And in that place, you'll find a lot of ideas come to you when you're really just, everything else is completely blocked out and you're really focused. Then you'll find a lot of things come in, a lot of ideas come to you, so.
What are some things that you do to create this focus?
Um,
How do you find focus?
yeah, good question. I think an important aspect of that is rest, so that you're not burned out. It's very easy, like your type of personality, my type of personality. It's very easy to just grind 24/7, because relentlessness kind of comes with the territory. You're relentless, and so being relentless is a great quality. You can accomplish much by being relentless, but you have to know when your ability to produce at a given level is some percentage less than what it could be, because you're just burnt out and you have to recharge, take time off, just kind of get into a place of being recharged and rested. And I find that I can focus much better when I'm rested. When I'm not, or when I'm kind of burnt out, I've just spent too much time focusing on too many little things that I just get distracted much easier. And that's really just the other part of our brain looking for pleasure, reward, and the reward circuits of the brain. That's a big piece of it. And then the early mornings are the other piece. Like from 5 a.m. to 9, 10 a.m. in the mornings, like a magic 4 or 5 hours, where like the bulk of productivity, I think, gets done there. The bulk of creativity gets done there. And there's physiological reasons why that's true. So you can make a really good argument that the purpose of sleep is to replete ATP, and that ATP is the currency of existence, and that what sleep does is it replenishes and charges up our ATP stores so they're at maximum when you wake up. And then that ATP is needed for every single thing that's going on in your brain, every single thing, to make the proteins themselves that drive higher cognition.
I definitely want to pick some of this apart. First thing I want to ask you is, how do you know when you're burnt out? How do you know when it's time to rest? What are some signs? Are you looking at your biometrics? Are you meditating and reflecting? How do you know when you've hit that wall?
I think that when you're not moving the chains forward in terms of whatever it is you're trying to do, sometimes ideas just aren't coming. The creative power just isn't coming. A lot of our ability to produce at a high level is physical. It really is. And that's what you see with age, is this decline in the ability to create, to produce, but it's physical in its nature. It's driven by drops in testosterone, drops in mitochondrial productivity, drops in all these things. So the physical part of you has to be sort of like in peak shape to perform at a peak level. And so the older I get, the more I really take that seriously, that, I can't produce anything at a high level unless I'm rested and well and in a very optimum place physically. And the physical aspects will drive all of the production and all that other stuff. So,
Yeah, and from my personal experience, I'm also, as you said, I'm also someone that is relentless, and a lot of the work that I do comes from a wave of inspiration that sometimes is completely just unpredictable.
yeah,
And I'm relentless in pursuing that inspiration
right.
when it arrives.
Yes,
So if it's
absolutely.
1 in the morning
Right,
and I'm in bed
right,
getting ready to go to
right,
sleep, I had a late
right,
night, and then I get one idea, I'm like, I'm bouncing off the bed and I'm gonna put that on
right.
paper somewhere. At least, even if it's a nugget that
Yeah,
will remind me to pursue that the next day. But like, I will never let a good idea dwindle. Like,
yeah,
like never, ever, ever, ever. All my ideas are written down somewhere. Like, my most valuable asset beyond my family, my loved ones, is like my notes. So I hope there's no like hackers here that secretly hate me, want to hack my computer, take my notes, because that's my number one most valuable thing, is my notes, my voice recordings. And okay, so that's great. Do you ever look at biometrics? Do you ever look at biometrics like HRV, for example, to determine when you need to capitalize on rest, or when you need to get more sleep, or when you need to take a nap? Or is it more like intuitive?
more intuitive. Yeah, not. I do once in a while, but not that much. I'm much more intuitive. Like, I really know my body, and I really know. And it's interesting you say, yeah, those waves of inspiration when they come, I've learned over the years that, you're waiting for those. It's like a surfer, and you're waiting for the wave,
Oh
and when
yeah.
it's there, you've got to be ready. And my wife has an ongoing joke about that, because when they hit me, like I, she calls it like, and she has some other ENTG friends. They do the same thing, and it's like her face goes like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
For those who aren't watching the podcast, who aren't seeing the video and are tuning in, imagine a caveman discovering fire. That's the face that
yeah,
Joel just made.
yeah. It's that face, and so when that face happens, you've got to be ready to write it down, because you will forget it. And yeah, some of
You
my
know,
best stuff is, I'm like you. I have like the notes when they come down, and yeah, it's very important. Yeah, and you don't have we don't get in life an inexhaustible supply of those. Like, it's very much like, you've got to grab stuff when it comes along. Yeah, so I've learned to really like be aware of those when they come. Yeah, for sure.
this is a health and wellness podcast, but I'm not recommending this, but there is a sort of unhealthy habit that I'll admit to. But it's helped me with some of my best ideas, and it's sometimes I'm in the car on a long drive. And when it's safe, let's say I have the car on autopilot, which my car can do, and there's no cars around, or if my girlfriend's next to me, I'll have her do it. It's to just tap the voice memo button on my phone, on my iPhone, and I'll just kind of talk. And I find that, I get this sort of feeling, these ideas, whenever I'm fully present, so that can be a lot of times when I'm on a long drive, when I'm in the shower. I take really long
I do
showers.
too.
I like to think in those
Yeah, me
showers.
too.
I
Yeah,
love to. My girlfriend gives me so much shit. She's like, "Hey, you're taking like, what are you doing in there? Like, you're taking so long." And I'm like, I'm literally just
yeah,
thinking. or when I'm about to go to sleep, when I wake up in the morning, especially meditation. And you mentioned, which definitely want to come back to this, meditation in the early morning. So that 5 to 9 a.m. window, I find that that's just like magical because I'll put it this way. Like if I'm taking time to pursue a hobby, let's say I'm spearfishing and I'm in the water, I'm doing that during work hours. Like I know in the back of my head, I could be doing something productive for my business. I could be talking to clients. I could be online, etc. But at 5 a.m., no one's counting on me. Those are not work hours. There's nothing. It's like I can just meditate, be clear, channel some of this energy, get really good ideas down. Yeah, I mean, that's just magical. Do you have a particular routine early morning that you follow to get into that flow, or is it just like a matter of waking up and attacking, putting ideas down? Like, how does that work early
Yeah,
mornings?
so I'll get up. My ideal routine is I'll get up like around 5, and then I will go hit the supplement cabinet, and I'll take some nicotinamide mononucleotide, typically just to get the spark going. And I'll usually do.
Okay, can I just for the people that are tuning in that are not familiar with NMN, it's not. Can we just make it clear? It's not nicotine. It's
Right.
nicotinamide
Yeah.
mononucleotide. So for those who aren't familiar, I just wanted to clear that up there.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
go for it.
Those of you that aren't familiar, it's what's called so it is an NAD precursor. When you're depleted of NAD, nothing's going to work right in the body. You need NAD to make energy, and you need to do lots of things. And NMN, especially if you didn't get a great night's sleep, it helps. It helps to give you the NAD that your body needs to make the energy, to make the proteins, to do all this stuff. So typically, the first thing I'll do is I'll hit that. I'll have sometimes I'll mix in some molecular hydrogen, or very often I'll mix in some ketones. Really, just stuff for to charge the brain, and then I'll go and typically try and take about 45 minutes and go sit outside and just be still and just be with God and just try and be still. It's really we live in an age right now where addiction is ever present in terms of like we're all to varying degrees addicted to these dopamine hits from electronics and from stimulation, and it didn't exist 30 years ago. And so stillness is like the rarest commodity now, and it's in stillness and silence. That's where all the answers are. And so it's very hard to be still because your mind is running to all the stuff you got to do. So the best time to be still is in the morning, before the day starts and before you start to think about all this stuff. So I like to go and just be still and listen a lot, and then from there I'll usually start my day.
So let's take it back to the supplements because I'm sure a lot of people are very curious about the specifics. So for NMN, is there a particular brand? Do you always combine it with a sirtuin like resveratrol? Is there anything else in there in the NMN supplement that you appreciate?
So part of what I do is I created this way to eat called the Immunity Code Diet, or you call it 2-day core, and it revolves around stimulating gut bacteria one day to potentiate all the mechanisms of fasting and and the sirtuins and all these things that we want to stimulate, but to kind of supercharge those the next day. And so it depends on the day of the week. I work in an alternating strategy where typically Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, that's the day that I'm really focusing more on like supplements and small molecules. So, and I run different stacks depending on my intuition and depending on how much I've done. I don't ever do the same thing all the time. I'm always mixing things up. One thing that the longer you've done this stuff, you'll see is that everything works kind of in a reverse sine wave. So you'll get this sort of like bump the first, the initial going of anything, and then the more you do that same thing over time, it goes below the x-axis, and then you start to see negatives over time. So in order to kind of like mitigate that, I have a lot of different stacks of things that I do. So it just depends on the outcome I'm looking for. But like typical example might be I will stack berberine with resveratrol, NMN, and apigenin with
I was about to say Apigenin. I noticed that on your Instagram the other day.
and ketones in the AM. I'll do that. Like that's one stack I might use, and that
Ketones are using like a ketonade.
ketone Franks,
Ketonade.
ketonade, yeah.
Yeah, I had Frank
Yeah,
on the show a little
yeah,
while back, and his stuff before a
it's
podcast
great.
is like, and before sleep is like,
That's
oh my
great.
God,
Yeah, it's
so
great.
good.
Yeah. So I'll do kind of that stack, and that'll be like kind of my AM what I call small molecule stack. And the purpose of that is, so between going after the gut bacteria the day before and then adding in the small molecules, we're just, think of it as a throttle. We're just really opening up the throttle on all of these different processes in the body that we want to give a little bit of jet fuel to periodically. And the net of all these things is that you don't have to fast as long, and you're regularly inducing in things like autophagy, ubiquination, the SERT pathways, and the incretins, GIP, GLP-1, all these big acronyms for things. You're turning those things up on a regular basis. And so that's one stack. Another one I might do.
For those who aren't familiar with what these mechanisms are, can you maybe just give us an overview of what they do?
Yeah. So,
how are these beneficial?
So our bodies, our cells the best way to think of cells is that they're essentially a merger between computers, 3D printers, power plants, and buildings. Like, they're structure, but they produce energy, they make things, and they are involved in, talking to each other and all this really advanced communication. It's kind of like cells are essentially computers. They really process a lot of information, and they make a lot of decisions. They have to make very important decisions about things like, should we go on? Should we stop? Should we divide? Should we turn on the trash? So what research over the last 10 years has given really good credence to is that there's some basic things that probably help us to age better, probably help us to live a little bit longer. And many of them have to do with either taking out the cellular trash, which we call that either the ubiquitin proteasome pathway, or we call that autophagy. So it's either that, or has to do with helping your DNA to transcribe and copy better. Okay, and that goes by a lot of different words. You can call that HDAC inhibition, methylation. There's different forms of that. But basically, as we get older, DNA starts to lose bits of information, and so then you're making these really poor copies, and then those poor copies translate into not being able to make the proteins your body needs to make in order to maintain the machine. So that's a big thing. And then there are these key signal pathways that sort of work as master regulators. And the one that is most people are now getting somewhat familiar with is the AMPK pathway and the sirtuins. And so the sirtuins are HDAC inhibitors. They have a lot to do with making DNA read better, but they intertwine with this longevity pathway called AMPK. And long story short, it all revolves around energy production in the cell. So cells need to produce energy at a certain level, and they have all these advanced sensors in them. One of them is what's called a heterotrimeric sensor. It's a 3-pronged sensor, and it sticks in the cell membrane, and the first one senses ATP, the next senses ADP, and the third senses AMP. So that's just adenosine triphosphate, diphosphate, monophosphate. Yeah. And so when the gas tank gets low, the meter for AMP fires off, and essentially what it does is it tells the cell to start recycling spare parts for energy so that, we can keep the lights on. And there's benefit to that. There's benefits to taking the trash out. Like, if you let the trash pile up around your house, eventually, it wouldn't be a great place to live. But if you take the trash out on a regular basis, then the house functions normally. And so that's the best way to understand it, is a lot of these pathways just converge on maintenance, really is a good way to understand it. And we can turn those on by different things. We have some basic things that will allow us to go at those things. One of those is the bacteria in our gut. So certain bacteria talk to human genes and help to activate these different pathways. Species of Bifidobacteria, for example, will activate the sirtuins or AMPK. And so the bacteria in our gut help to potentiate the right bacteria, help to potentiate longevity. They turn on human longevity genes. And then in conjunction with that, the diurnal rhythm that we live in lends itself out to certain times of the day doing certain things better than others. Like, you tend to sleep better at night, right? Well, you tend to repair better at night, and that's because a lot of machinery is going off. If we combine a few things like hunger, fasting, the right bacteria, these small molecules we're talking about, and then a few other things like cold and exercise, then we come up with a pretty decent little basic formula to give the body regular inputs of this on a regular basis. Like I do it about 3 times a week. I'll stack all those things together and just kind of give my body a little dose of that. Okay. I don't do it all the time. You can do harm by doing this stuff all the time. So it's really about understanding what goes into it and how often to apply it, what, when, and how. Okay. So understanding that we can influence our rate of aging through some very simple things, and then taking that a level up and understanding that when to apply these things and the frequency is kind of like a brand new thing, 5 years new for most people in their awareness. And that's kind of what I've been, really in the middle of is pushing out a system to help people do that kind of stuff. So,
Well, that's a great way to take people through that process and to gain appreciation towards the different levels that there are. And of course, we were talking about this morning routine and how you do this 3 times a week. What are you doing the other 4 days? Is there something that will complement this stack, or is it just sort of like a minimalist approach to recover from the stack? What are you doing the remainder
yeah.
of those
So
days?
I'm always working in a 2-day split, always. The first day is leaning more in my diet towards having more like fibers and starches, key fibers and starches in my diet. Okay. And then the other day, the next day is lean towards not having any of that stuff in my diet, just leaning more towards not having carbs in the diet. And that's the foundation to understand what we're doing, which is one of the most important control mechanisms over aging is insulin. Insulin controls the body's growth signals. Insulin is like the accelerator on aging. Okay, it's the accelerator on growth. If we were to map out the inside of a cell and what happens when you bring sugar in a cell and all the different machines that get turned on when you bring sugar in the cell, you'd walk away from that going, oh, wow, insulin is the thing that drives aging. Oh my gosh, because insulin controls the progression of cell cycles. And you got to remember, you only have 50, 60 divisions of every cell in your body across your lifetime. And you get to choose how fast you use those up to some degree. Okay. One of the mechanisms is insulin. So the rate of production of insulin has a whole lot to do with the body progressing through cell cycles, and it has a lot to do with other things that control growth. And so the thing about insulin is it works very much like a muscle. It's trainable. It works very much like something that if you don't use, you lose the ability to use it. And if you do use it, it gets very sharp, gets very strong. So it's very similar to like running or deadlifting or biking or anything. If you do it on a regular basis, you're going to be pretty good. If you never use it, you're going to be terrible at it. So one of the failings of this age that we're in is a lot of fad diets have been really focused on like no carb or low carb dieting. And what they completely failed to understand in the process was that insulin sensitivity is not a constant. It's a variable, and it's based on how often you use it. And when you stop stimulating it, it's like you stop training. And so you get obese in that sense. You get insulin resistance when you don't train it. And it's very common nowadays to see people coming off like, long-term keto or carnivore diets or fasting, and their insulin sensitivity is just racked, like they have none, and they have to train it back into the body. So one of the best things that you can do for your longevity is 2 things. Number one, to have very good insulin sensitivity, where insulin is very sharp. It's like a muscle that you train. It's very good, it's very strong. But at the same time, spin down the total production of insulin across your week. So you're making insulin efficiently, but you're not making it constantly. And that's a really important concept to understand. Because if you do that, what you are taking into your destiny under your control is 2 things. Number one, the total amount of insulin, the rate at which you produce insulin, okay? If you cut that in half, you're going to age better. Just that one thing. The other piece is that if you strategically stimulate it, it's going to be very efficient, okay? And when you look at different body types, you can explain every body type by insulin efficiency. You could look at dad bod and go, oh, he's just insulin resistant. You can look at that guy that eats whatever he wants, and it's like, he's just insulin. He has high insulin sensitivity. You can explain it all through that. So what I do is basically it's called the immunity code diet, the 2-day core. What I do essentially is one day I will stimulate insulin directly. I'll go right at it, and I'll eat things that will make the body produce insulin. But everything that I'm eating in one way or another improves the efficiency of insulin. So example would be in the morning, I'll do berry phenols. Okay. Berries have color pigments in them that get in the serum, and then they affect insulin sensitivity in a positive way. They affect fat oxidation.
So like anthocyanin, for example.
Anthocyanins, cyanidin 3, glucoside, cyanidin 3, galactoside, all of these different phenols and carotenoids and different things that get into the serum, they are very, very good at sensitizing insulin. Okay, they make insulin. You have to make insulin to deal with this stuff, but they sensitize it at the same time. That's very different from, let's say,
A quick question for you. What if you overconsume the berries? If someone's listening
yeah,
to this and automatically
right,
starts to go, oh,
right,
oh, great. So
right.
so berries in the morning.
Mhm.
Is there a limit to how many
Yeah, that's a
where's the
great
drop
question.
off?
So the thing you have to understand, and it's a new dimension of understanding. Again, I said insulin sensitivity is not a constant. It's a variable. It's like an exercise. If you're not doing it, you're not going to be good at it. You're going to suck at it. So if you haven't been training, if you haven't been, let's talk about sprints. You haven't been sprinting. I'm not going to go and ask you to go to a track and run an all-out quarter mile. You tear every muscle in your legs and kill yourself. Okay, practically. All I want you to do today is take a walk around the track. Just walk one lap. That's it. We'll do that for a week, and then next week, I'm going to have you do a light jog, and then the week after that, another light jog, just slightly faster. And I would slowly ramp you, building up your muscles, your tendons, your endurance until maybe in about 2 months, 3 months, I could have you do a quarter mile at a decent pace. Okay, insulin. The way to think of insulin is that it works the same way. If you haven't been stimulating insulin directly, meaning you've been doing low carb diet, you've been doing carnivore, you've been doing keto, you've been doing intermittent fasting, you're not going to be able to come in right away and eat even moderate amounts of carbs because your insulin sensitivity sucks. You're going to have to start very, very small. Just like that guy starting on the track, doing one lap, walking. You're going to have to start with minute amounts and build your insulin sensitivity up slowly. And that's a very important distinction. It's not in the general awareness. I have another book coming out this year. Hopefully it will explain that a lot to the masses, that insulin sensitivity is not a constant. So yeah, really good question.
Yeah, I actually have worked with a couple of carnivore folks who were doing carnivore as an elimination diet, and you'd see these guys, and they're like super fit, healthy guys. And I have one of them who wanted to start gaining weight, and really doing more of like a bodybuilding approach. And you want to get some starches in your diet to build up your glycogen stores and be able to approach these big, heavy compound movements with a lot of energy.
I wiped him out.
And it's like this guy would have like, one banana,
Yeah.
and he'd be like, dude, like, oh, my brain fogged. Like, I
Yeah.
think it's an intolerance. And
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, like, you need to
Yeah.
build yourself up. And actually, I wanted to get your take on something that I wrote about insulin sensitivity. It's sort of like an analogy that I use to describe the mechanisms and how lifestyle habits can help improve your insulin sensitivity. I'm really curious to get your take on this. So I wrote this down here. It says, exercise improves insulin sensitivity by increasing glucose uptake via these molecular mechanisms. So there's boost in GLUT4 concentration. There's GLUT4 translocation to cell membranes, capillarization of skeletal muscle, reducing intramuscular triglyceride, increased beta cell activity. And then the analogy, so that's the scientific. The analogy goes like this. Imagine your body is a train station. To optimize the flow of people, or in this case, the metabolism of nutrients, the conductors of the train station, in this case, insulin, need to properly signal the opening and closing of doors, in this case, GLUT4 receptors on muscle, to allow just enough people in at just the right time. The more your trains move, so exercise and physical activity, the better job your conductors can do, the higher insulin sensitivity. And an added bonus is that it puts greater demand on your train station to upgrade its infrastructure and hire more conductors. These are your hypothetical train station upgrades awarded by movement. There's more conductors, so increased beta cell activity for insulin. There's more trains, so you make muscle gains, you have capillarization of muscle, a boost in GLUT4 concentration, and optimal use of space in the train carts themselves. So there's lower intramuscular triglyceride. So to protect your train station from wear and tear, so sarcopenia, lower testosterone, injury, etc., combine resistance training, so trains moving more quickly, and aerobic training, trains are traveling further. And so in this imaginary train station, supply always meets demand. so long as you demand health. And that's typically how I describe insulin sensitivity to the average person. I'm curious to get your take, and I'm curious to know how would you build this up, considering the way that you
Yeah,
organize
so I
your
like that.
day.
I like what you did there. And you're right on point. The only thing there that I would probably change would be, so the insulin's not working directly on the GLUT4s. It's working on the insulin receptor. Between the insulin receptor and the GLUT4s, that's where the problem is for most people. So what will happen is a whole chain of events between there can happen, potentiated by other things to drive insulin resistance. And so it's that the connection between how sensitive the insulin receptor is, which is a fascinating thing we could get into. It's a three-stack protein. It's comprised of syntaxin, VAMP23, VAMP25 snare, and it's called the snare complex. And it has to do a lot of things correctly, and it's supported by all of these essentially what are called tyrosine kinase scaffolds that are, complex. They have to be very specific, and they have to essentially phosphorylate a very specific chain of proteins. And so anything can go wrong in there. And so it's when you look at like problems with insulin sensitivity, inflammation, for example, you'll see the issue gets to before you ever get to GLUT4 receptor, you get problems way back there. But generally speaking, you're pretty much right on there, particularly with the effect of exercise on insulin, and also, not only that, exercise mimics insulin. So exercise can do the same thing. It can transport sugar into the muscles. But yeah, I like that a lot.
So basically, for reflecting on this analogy, the layer that you're adding is sort of, if you take the conductor and they're pressing the button to open up the doors of the train station, it's like the circuitry underneath that button that then
There's a
opens
whole
up the
bunch of
doors.
there's a whole bunch of things that can happen and that can go wrong in between there. So, but generally speaking, yeah, that's the only thing I would add.
What are the signs? What are the signs and symptoms that that's the problem?
Hmm.
Like, can you take someone that does,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
exercise and the aerobic training and has a healthy diet, but then has those problems, and
Mhm.
how do you diagnose? How do you know what the signs and
So you
symptoms
gave a
are?
good example of your carnivore guy, and that's very common, by the way. Like I weekly have people coming that did carnivore, or they did keto, or they did fasting, and their insulin sensitivity is shot. So they'll go and they'll have some carb source, and they're wrecked by it completely, and they think, oh, I can't digest carbs. Carbs are bad. Blah blah. They get in this narrative. They tell themselves, because that's what Pop Nutrition tells them is true. But what's really going on, the thing that like I have to explain to them is, this is all that happened here is you just tried to run a 400 meters with no training. That's all. You've got to build back your ability to handle carbs by increasing your insulin sensitivity. You've wrecked it by the way you were eating. And so that's the simplest way to tell, is when someone has carbohydrates, what happens? Do they handle them efficiently, or do they get tired? Do they get brain fog? And that's an easy way to know. Another really easy way to know is just simply body compartments. It's you can tell pretty much. So particularly, and there's different compartments that will hold fat and in certain ways and tell you kind of what the issue is. Right around the belly fat's kind of typically your dead giveaway for insulin resistance. So belly button, right around the belly button fat, that's typically going to be a combination of hypoxic fat with insulin resistance in your fat. You can also look at, like, if they have really bad gas, typically, like when they're going to the bathroom, typically that's going to be like their gut biome is not so great. It's more pathobonts than commensals. And then typically what goes with that is their insulin resistance is going to suck. You can tell that way. So there's definitely a lot of different clues you can look at. You can look at you can look at more kind of classical things. You can look at basically the test for insulin resistance is there's a 60 and a 90-minute challenge, and you're going to take in 50 grams of glucose, and then after 60 to 90 minutes, if you're over 120 still, then that's classified as insulin resistance. So that's the most classical way of doing it.
So again, reflecting on the analogy, because I do want to add some notes here, and I want to make this as complete as possible. I want to do the science justice. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like the conductor, insulin, went on vacation for so long that at this point he comes back to the train station. He's
Yeah,
like, "What button do I
yeah.
press to,
He's kind of
you know,
like,
get the
it's
door to
been a
open
minute.
properly?"
Wait. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Because you
Yeah,
can have all the machinery technically there,
right.
the remaining
Yeah.
machinery, but it's like the ability, right? Okay. All right. So we've gone on a few rabbit holes now. I want to return to a couple things. Actually, before I get there, you were describing this
Yeah.
2-day
Right.
approach, right? It's
Right.
like one day you do this, the next day you do that. On which one of these days are you doing more of the work?
Mhm.
Are you doing more of the thinking, the ideas? Is it on
Doesn't
a
really
low
matter.
carb day?
Either one's fine. My yeah, it doesn't affect me at all.
Really?
My insulin sensitivity is pretty good. What I left out there was one day I'm stimulating insulin directly, and that's important. But equally important is the next day I'm stimulating insulin indirectly, and that's the piece that is really not on the table that no one's really talking about. And it's that insulin doesn't work by itself. Insulin is kind of like a it's kind of like an aircraft carrier deployment. And when you deploy an aircraft carrier, you got subs, you got destroyers, you got frigates. You have all these ships around the carrier, and they all make up one thing. And insulin's very much like that. So there's all these other hormones, adiponectin, and what are called the incretin hormones, glucose insulotropic polypeptide GIP, and glucagon-like peptide GLP, and glucagon. And there's all these different family of hormones that can be directly stimulated by foods, and learning how to stimulate them directly, or learning how to stimulate insulin indirectly by stimulating the family of insulin hormones, is how you really attack it. So you attack insulin directly from the one hand one day, and then indirectly the other day. And so that's the basic of how I do things. And what's interesting is a lot of foods that don't really stimulate insulin directly stimulate the helper hormones. So example would be an egg. An egg is a really good stimulator of GLP-1, and walnuts are really good at stimulating adiponectin, but they don't really have a very big glycemic index. And so once you begin to understand how these foods work, then you can build this pattern where one day you're going after insulin, but the next day you're not making insulin, but you're stimulating the other hormones, and that's how you really build a real foundation that will last.
And is there a way to test those helper hormones
Yeah, I
like
mean, you
you
can
test
you can do
insulin?
tests for things like GIP and glucagon and all that stuff.
Okay, so now returning to some of the morning routine stuff. One thing I wanted to discuss is this concept of you get the heavy hitters out of the way early morning, and I think a lot of that has to do with and please interrupt if you're inspired to here because maybe you can fill in the gaps. But when you get good sleep, the idea is you replenish ATP, you also replenish dopamine, and so this sort of delayed gratification effect, you're a little more sensitive to it in the sense that you can really work in those hours to get something out of the way. And by the time you depleted dopamine, as naturally it's depleted throughout the day, then later on you could do more of the what is it, the ISTJ kind of stuff. You can just focus on knocking things out and maybe even being creative because if I'm not mistaken, I think serotonin kicks up, dopamine is low. So what's your take on that? And maybe if you can help us fill in the gaps as you typically,
Well,
as you
a
do.
big issue is your nighttime cortisol pattern. Okay. It's kind of like where your cortisol peak happens while you're sleeping is a big deal. So if you're kind of overstretched and your nighttime cortisol peak is happening at the wrong time, then you're not gonna you're not gonna really be like kind of in your peak state when you wake up. And so there's simple ways to address. There's a whole host of things you could do to address that. One of the things I like to do is combine whey protein, which has the large neutral amino acids. It has all these serotonin precursors, and you can combine that with EPA, high dose EPA oil, and icosapentaenoic acid, the eicosanoids that it makes. Those help to kind of suppress cortisol. So I like to take those and combine them into a shake about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's kind of a strategic insert to help cortisol kind of get to where it should be. Um, by the way, that's one of the reasons that there's a couple reasons, but one of the reasons that it's very common for people in high stress environments, they'll come home at night and they'll medicate on carbohydrates and alcohol, is because they're looking to get their feel good hormones up, and they're doing it through food, they're doing it through alcohol, they're looking to de-stress. And so I like to shortcut that in the afternoon, which is when kind of like the dopamine tends to crater with like a shake like that, or other different kinds of things.
Well, and then cortisol being very glycolytic, and you have a high, very very intense job, and if you don't have very good insulin sensitivity, it could lead you to glycemic at that point, and then have this craving, this hedonic craving for carbohydrate. So if you don't have that cortisol spike properly, it can lead to a lot of hedonic hunger. So your dinner is typically
Oh gosh,
around that
no. My
time,
dinner is
4
typically
p.m.
about 6 to 7. 6 to 7. I'll do a preload meal typically like
Okay.
that. I call it a preload. Well, it is a preload. Yeah, preload meal is a meal. It's a small meal that you have before a larger meal, and then it can be highly functional. So you can use different preload meals for different outcomes. A lot of like what I teach, like in my book and in my courses and stuff, is using preload meals strategically to affect the next meal, to affect the parameters of the next meal. But you can also use them for other things. So stress amelioration is like the example I just gave. You can use a preload for that. But yeah, so I'll have a preload meal in the afternoon. It just depends on like what I'm going for, like functionally. If I'm going to have like a higher carb dinner, then I'll have a preload meal that helps offset the insulin response, helps increase fat oxidation, helps do all that stuff in the preload meal.
So like lowering the
Well,
glycemic
what you do
index.
is you're lowering the you're shifting the glucose area under the curve. So instead of getting a spike like that, you're getting something more like that. Okay, and for those of you that can't see that, I was showing a high initial spike versus like kind of a long slow spike, and so the meal that you have prior. Meal-to-meal sequencing is a real thing. I mean, it's been empirically validated and measured that what you have at one meal can affect the next meal. And so I'm just taking that and using it to my advantage where I can have certain things at a preload meal. Example I like to use is red phenols with whey protein and resistant starch if I'm going to have a high carb meal. Resistant starch, whey protein, red phenols work on a number of different levels. Whey protein helps insulin sensitivity. Resistant starch will actually help increase rates of fat oxidation. And it's been proven, like in studies, you can go and read this stuff. Red phenols actually impair enzymes the body needs to digest carbs. And so you get these incremental shifts in the way food is handled. Now, it's not a panacea. It doesn't it's not like a get out of jail free card. It doesn't work that way. But what you're doing is, it's like athletics. In athletics, you're looking for that 5% improvement, that 10% improvement. And these preload meals are a way to give yourself very significant improvements in meal-to-meal function within the body. So if I'm gonna have a high carb dinner, like I know I'm going out, I know I'm gonna have, whatever, I might have some bread, then I'll do a preload meal that's real functional like that. But typically, yeah, I'll eat dinner about 7 o'clock at night. And depending on the night, if it's like a Monday or a Wednesday or a Friday, it kind of looks like just a healthy meal. It's rich in fiber, rich in good protein, steak. Nothing too special about it, other than the types of fibers typically you'll see me having at a meal like that are either inulins like asparagus or cabbages or things that are going to feed the right bacteria in the gut.
So when you're mentioning something like red phenols, is this something that you isolate, or is this coming from a whole food source? And then my second question that you can follow this up with is going back to like the blueberry question, right? Like when you talk about resistant starches, you can have cold rice, right? You cool it for 24 hours, develops resistant starches, but how much rice is too much rice in this case? So if you could maybe
Well, it
shed
depends
some
on the
light on
time you
on
have.
those
A lot
two.
of things, it depends on the time that you have it. It depends on what you have it with. All these things matter. Typically, like resistant starches, things like that, I tend to have around noontime. I don't have those typically too much later in the day. I'll have them roughly around noon. Like anything that's kind of starchy, like potatoes or rice or things like that, starchy stuff. I'll have kind of around lunch if I'm going to have them. Typically, like I'm 220 pounds, so the amount that I typically have ranges from a half a cup to a cup of one source, like brown rice, and then I'll combine that with a half a cup to a cup of garbanzo beans, for example, and I'll kind of mix them together. And the thing to understand about, like, we think of carbs. When we use the word carb, we think carb's kind of a dumb word. It just makes us think, oh, well, just a carb. Carbs are just a dumb thing. It doesn't work that way in practice. When you get into like the aspects of what different types of oligosaccharides do when they're in the body, it's a fascinating field, particularly the way that different types of starches can affect what are called post-translational modifications. It gets into some very interesting stuff. So starches have a lot of functional power when they're in the body, and they work on a number of different levels, and different types of starches can do different things when they're in the body. And so it's an underappreciated aspect of these things that we call carbs.
So when you
Hmm.
mention something like oligosaccharides, those can be sometimes
Yeah.
very high
Hmm.
FODMAP foods. right?
Hmm.
So how do you draw the line when it comes to like the net benefit? Is it
Hmm.
completely bio-individual? Like,
Hmm.
if you want to get
Hmm.
those oligosaccharides for this
Hmm.
benefit
Hmm.
and then you're bloated,
Hmm.
will you
Hmm.
take the oligosaccharide and deal with the bloating,
So
or
the
or
FODMAP paradigm is based on the idea that the problem is
how
the
do you deal with
foods.
that?
Okay. And in my book, I point out that very often that's not the case. The problem is not the food, it's the bugs. And it's a very provable thing. You can take a number of different issues. Yeah,
As the
exactly. Yeah.
bug, by bugs
So
you mean become
one of the things that I
microorganisms.
point
Okay.
out, like in the book, is that you can take things that people think are impossible, like oh, I have these gluten reactions, I have lactose intolerance, I have these histamine reactions. It's just the way it is. I can't have these foods, and then you can drive commensal bacteria in the gut, and those issues completely vanish. Okay, because the problem was never the foods. The problem was you were missing the bacteria that had the genes needed to digest those things. The whole sort of FODMAP question really lands itself into a little bit of trouble because it presumes the problem is the foods. And what and I've got literally at this point thousands of testimonials of people that have said, wow, this really worked. My lifelong issue went away, as soon as I changed the bacteria in my gut. So I'm not saying that's true in every case. Sometimes you have to eliminate certain foods, but as often as not, the issue is not the foods, it's that you're missing certain bacteria. And if you will take some time and slowly titrate in the commensal bacteria, you'll find that the issues you were having tend to either be greatly reduced or go away completely. And so when it comes to mixing in like certain things like oligosaccharides, very often what you find is that by going through some simple protocols, a lot of the issues you were having aren't there anymore. It stops being an issue. And so most of the people that come through my stuff, like the immunity code, they're doing all those protocols. And, not in every case, there's no 100% solution, but very often, more often than not, people are coming in with issues. And by the time they get through, those issues are gone. And it's because of the bacteria, not the foods.
Right. So it's a completely bio-individual problem, and you can get the benefits across the board so long as you know where you're sitting and you do the right testing and you can identify the symptoms and therefore address the specific strains of bacteria or your genetics, and then from there you know make the right decisions to bring it all together and feed several birds with one loaf, so to speak. You get the benefits of the oligosaccharide in this case. You don't get the bloating. You feel good. Your body can digest it, etc.
The province of medicine is with the individual, like people get these individual differences that only doctors can address, and that's why we have that. So the stuff that I do typically is stuff that where you find commonalities with people. Okay, and sometimes those commonalities can be really, really powerful. I mean, sometimes those commonalities can be more powerful than the individual things. A simple example would just be vitamin D. Like, I don't care who you are, if your vitamin D is like in the teens, you're going to have a whole bunch of problems. Okay, and if your vitamin D's, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you're going to see those problems go away, and that's true of every human being on the planet. You don't have to be individual for that to be true. So with regard to issues with the gut, there's some basic things that are very simple to implement and have a pretty decent ameliorative impact for most people. Like just things they were seeing, like I couldn't tolerate this food, I couldn't tolerate that food, and suddenly they can do it. And those are things that are very, very easy to do. Don't require like a whole bunch of you don't have to split the atom to figure that out. So.
And do you think that the bulk of health and wellness research that it ultimately denies this bio-individuality? If we're looking for specific effects, right, on a global scale in a larger population, let's say, for example,
Mm-hmm.
is fiber good for
Mm-hmm.
you? Is
Mm-hmm.
probiotics, are they good for you? Or are
Mm-hmm.
they, how do they, you know, and this is
Mm-hmm.
definitely at a higher level. Do you think that ultimately it denies bio-individuality?
Uh,
Is in favor, is it somewhere in the middle? Not to get
yeah.
controversial, but just, considering something as
Well, I think
bio-individual as
that
this.
we have, as a current sort of meme in this age, taken the concept of bioindividuality and made it more than it is. Like, our commonalities are profound as people. Like, everybody listening to this needs to breathe air. I don't care who you are. Okay, and your life depends on breathing air. Every single person. That's common to all of us. And what happens when you breathe air? That's common to all of us. It's common to everybody. Okay, now you can have you can have, whatever, fibrosis of the lungs, for example, and that impedes your ability to take in air. Okay. And that's a medical condition. But the commonalities that we have are profoundly impactful. And I think that we've kind of taken this thing of bio-individuality so far that it's gone a little too far, because basic things like having balance in the diet, gee, that's an innovative idea, right? Having balance in the diet profoundly affects the health of individuals in long-lasting, far-reaching ways. And it's just true more than it's not true. It's true of just about everybody. And there's a lot of things like that, that like you can look at a person and say, what are you doing? And they'll explain what they're doing. And I'll say, well, there's no health, there's no balance in your diet. There's no variety. There's no health in your diet. You're just doing this one thing. You're just eating this. Yeah, I know, but it's good, and it's like, it's not good. It's not going to be good for you in long term. And that's common to all humans. Like, we've all had seasons all throughout history where different foods came in and out of availability and variety and all that. That's just built into our diet. So that's an example of something that's common to everybody that's profoundly impactful long term. And what you see is when people eliminate balance in their diet, they might see some short term improvements, but long term, by and large, they're seeing massive problems. So I guess to answer your question, there is absolutely a component to human health that is individual and depends on things like, gene expression or SNPs and all that stuff. But then equally powerful are the commonalities. And sometimes, in fact, the problem is in the commonalities. Like, you're just not doing the basics. You're not doing the stuff that's common to all of us, So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It does. It does. And I have a follow up for that. And I know these are more abstract philosophical questions. We'll get back into the concrete stuff in just a second. But I'm wondering, in order to, let's say, does embracing our bio individuality, for the sake of being 5 to 10% better, and what that, entails is being anal about what you're eating and the order and this and organizing your life around all these little details. Do you think that takes us away from the commonality that brings us together with other people in our society? You think embracing bio-individuality for the sake of embracing who we are as an individual can take us away from this collective experience that is also a major component of something like
Well, where my
optimal
mind
health
goes to when
longevity?
you ask me that question is like, I hang out in circles of people that are pretty healthy, generally speaking. Like, most of them don't drink, most of them like, when dessert comes to the table, they don't indulge, they don't do that. I think there's a value to the things that humans have always done, because kind of what's always worked probably is going to always work. And one of the things that humans have always done is they've always gotten together in groups and and laughed
Find your
and
tribe.
enjoyed food and enjoyed drink and, not been so anal about like, I can't do this, I can't do that. And they've just given into the moment and enjoyed themselves, and enjoyed company and fellowship with people. And I think to the extent that, when you start to lose some of that, I think maybe that it's time to dial it in a little bit and let yourself go have a little bit of fun, go enjoy that time, go be social, go do what humans have always done, and I think it's easy. It's sort of easy to get into like the me schedule and the I routine. And you're so into like, I've got to do this at this time, and I've got to like, and then I need this, and then I need that, and then you kind of become like a Formula One, like you're only good for the track, you know, you're not multi-purpose. So that's kind of a philosophical answer, but I think that to where it interferes with just, I would put at the highest priority the experience of life itself. Like experiencing life and experiencing laughter and joy and love and friendship and wonder and all of these things. And I think it's very easy to get so anal about success and everything that drives success that you're not having any of that.
So basically, to really render this down to its the simplest terms, it's being yourself, doing what really gives you a sense of fulfillment, and just being you, and then in the process finding those that are also themselves whose company you can enjoy and make this more
Yeah, I
collective
think
experience.
if COVID taught us anything, it's
And
that people are the essential nutrient. Like when you subtract people out of the equation, we go nuts fast. Like, we need each other. We need company. We need to be around each other, and life is just better.
Cool. So, all right. So I told you we would shift gears. Yeah, we could talk about the philosophical all day, and I appreciate your answers and the depth of these answers very much so. But I definitely want to pick your brain
Yeah.
about gut
Yeah.
microbiome and body composition. You're one of the OGs that discovered this relationship, and I'd love to learn more about how something like your gut microbiome diversity can
Mm-hmm.
influence things like your resting metabolic rate,
Mm-hmm.
your adipose
Mm-hmm.
tissue,
Mm-hmm.
energy levels,
Yeah.
etc.
Well, the first thing to understand is that the the bacteria in our gut, you have obviously, different species, different taxa, different classifications, and different things that they do. But the first thing to understand is that those bacteria, just like us, have a metabolism, a genome, just like us. Okay, so you have these separate individuals, separate genome. You have these things with a separate genome inside your body, and they have their own metabolism. And as such, that means that they need certain things. They need certain things to thrive, and that certain things favor one group versus another. When I say that they have a metabolism, anything that has a metabolism makes byproducts of that metabolism, makes metabolic byproducts. Just think of it as the poop, so to speak. The metabolic byproducts of bacteria are released inside of us. Okay. And that has a very, very important impact on our body. So the other thing is that in this day and age, the concept of bacteria has taken on this halo effect that, bacteria must be good, right? But you have to remember that the purpose of our immune system in the gut is to keep out bacteria from the inside of the body. Okay. So when certain bacteria get inside the body, it's pathogenic. And so some bacteria are hardwired to be able to penetrate into the body. That's kind of their thing. They're really good at it. And other bacteria have so adapted to living with us that they're really good at strengthening the things that keeps us healthy, which keeps them healthy. So all this gets to, like, the rudder on the ship is the food that you're eating, because you have to, until now, we have thought of nutrition as I'm feeding me. But something that you hear me talk about a lot is I'll talk about some protocol and I'll say, now this doesn't feed you. And that's a key difference, is to begin to understand that there are times when you're not feeding you. There are times when specifically you're feeding the bacteria in your gut. And what you're doing is, it's probability. You're advantaging and giving a greater probability to the team that is going to help you win and do what you want. So what happens, the first problem that we have to kind of get our arms around is that bacteria in their cell walls, when they die, they break apart, they spill out toxins, and there's a couple of different toxins. There's peptidoglycan, there's lipopolysaccharide, and those trigger think of them as cell phone towers in the gut, nuclear agglomeration domain 1 and 2, NOD. These act as sort of like, it's like a first warning system. Like if we saw the nukes coming in from the Russians, we've got an early warning system that fires off all these signals. Let's call them like cell phone towers in the gut. These NODs, they fire off all these signals, and these signals can be inflammatory in nature. I mean, it's there to stop, something bad getting into us. So in that response, what can happen is that things can penetrate into the serum. It does a lot of toxic things in the body. Now, remember, we were talking about insulin just a minute ago, and I was talking about the insulin receptor, okay? And I was saying that there's a chain in between the insulin receptor and the GLUT4 proteins. So, for example, one of the things that lipopolysaccharide can do is it will trigger toll receptor 4, okay? And toll receptor 4 knocks out the first domino in the insulin receptor chain. It knocks out insulin receptor substrate 1, IRS1. And so when lipopolysaccharide gets in our serum, it does things like it'll find your body fat, okay? And inside your body fat, it'll drive insulin resistance by driving inflammation. And then because it's driving inflammation, it drives a recruitment into your body fat of the protectors, the anti-inflammatory or the inflammatory macrophages, the SWAT team. So the SWAT team is recruited into your body fat, and the goal of the SWAT team is to get rid of the offenders. But it doesn't really work out that way, because once lipopolysaccharide is in the serum, it's like that fire that keeps on burning. You can't put it out. That can destabilize the whole body, the entire body. You can lose the whole ship from that, because that one little thing in the gut that penetrates the gut, gets in your body fat, drives insulin resistance, drives macrophages in the gut, creates this chain reaction. And then what happens is your insulin sensitivity in your muscles goes, because insulin sensitivity in the muscles depends a lot on adipokines, depends a lot on hormones from fat to kind of tell it what to do. You begin to see that you have these massive metabolic issues, massive, that can result from little things in the gut going wrong. Very little things in the gut can. I heard someone the other day talk about insulin resistance as a pathology of skeletal tissue muscle, and nothing could be more wrong than that. Yeah, it's
the
completely wrong.
muscle-centric
Yeah, it's
approach
completely
to
wrong.
obesity.
Because when you look at the antecedents and like what's driving all this stuff, okay, there's a sequence of things that's happening, and typically it's beginning much earlier than that. So whenever you begin to look at like, oh well, there's issues with the muscle and the mitochondria. Yeah, well, those issues start elsewhere. They typically start in body fat, which itself started in the gut. And so all this to say, very small things can have massive ripples that affect the entire system. And it just begins really with the class of bacteria in the gut. So there's two that in my work I've focused on primarily, which is Akkermansia mucinilifa and the family of Bifidobacteria.
Akkermansia is the mother. Is that what they
I
call
don't
the
know
mother?
who's using that now.
Strain?
That's a new one, but
I know that this sounds super almost like fatty, but it's like that particular strain helps so many more grow and evolve. And if I'm not mistaken, if I'm talking about the right thing, I could be completely wrong, but it's like I think pomegranates are really good for building up your Akkermansia.
let's just say it's like a football team that gets on the team. Okay, yeah, that's the wide receiver. Okay, but there's a lot of other things involved. So
Okay.
I like to focus initially on Bifidobacteria because it's really the kind of the workhorse that you initially get from mom, and key strains of Bifidobacteria are intimately involved in the human immune system. I mean, they work hand in hand with antigen sensing and with dendritic cells in the gut, helping essentially priming the human immune system to better pull samples from the gut lumen and just decide, is this do we need something here? Do we need an antibody? What is this? And so Bifidobacteria, through cross-feeding reactions, through metabolites, tends to feed a lot of other things, generally speaking. And it's very easy to target Bifidobacteria. It's a very obtainable target. Like, we're in this age right now in the health space where novelty has become more important than accuracy. And so, I see people saying things for the sake of being novel and standing out, and it's just getting ridiculous because, yeah, they're just saying things that are novel
Well,
for
it's
the
clickbait.
potential of, like, pay attention to me because I'm saying things other people aren't. But when it comes to bacteria in the gut, is that you'll see things like, oh, there's this new strain bacteria that helps body fat, but it's impossible to target. Like, it's a big deal. Who cares? Bifidobacteria is very easy to target. Okay, you can feed it in a lot of different ways, and it's very simple to target. And you can spin it up. Yeah,
This can help
Bifidobacteria has a
improve
whole
your
lot
body
to do
composition.
with body composition. So does Akkermansia. They both work together very well. So the difference is Akkermansia is primarily the main bacteria in the gut mucus layer. Okay, so what Akkermansia does is it eats spit. It eats mucus. It eats mucins. Okay, and mucins are glycoproteins. So they're long chain carbohydrates bound to proteins. What Akkermansia does is it takes in mucins and breaks them up and gets the proteins and eats that. That's how it gets protein in its diet. But it prefers mucins that are internally secreted. By that I mean, think of the mucus in your mouth. Okay, that's what it prefers. It doesn't prefer protein from the diet. So when you're taking in protein from the diet and taking in high protein from the diet, you're actually disadvantaging Akkermansia production. It prefers internally secreted mucus. The key thing to understand about Akkermansia, it strengthens the gut mucus layer through a hormetic effect. What it does is it wears it down. It actually eats mucus, wears it down, and then the body responds by building it back up and fortifying it. And so think of Akkermansia as kind of like the free weights, and then in return, your gut builds a thicker mucus layer. Now, you can turn that on its head and take it to an extreme, and it happens in the case of fasting. So fasting will replete Akkermansia. It's one of the things that restores Akkermansia. In fact, in the immunity code, that's why we have you do target Bifidobacteria and fibers one day and fast the next, because you're feeding Akkermansia perfectly that way. Fasting will restore Akkermansia. The issue with that is if you do it too much. So if you do it too much, like you'll see people that were fasting for years and now they have these major gut issues. They wore the gut lining out by making too much Akkermansia. You can get too much of a good thing. And so if you're if you're fasting all the time and repleting Akkermansia, then it's the same thing as starvation. Starvation is known to wear the gut lining out. It just changed the words. Oh, starvation. Yeah. Okay. It's because you're making too much Akkermansia and you're getting too much action in the gut mucus layer of it eating the gut mucus layer down. So that's why balance is so critical.
And how do you measure that balance?
The way
how do you
that
know what's
the way that I
enough?
measure it is that you're not doing the inputs of any one thing too much. So like I'm not doing too much fasting. I'm not doing too much, red meat. I'm not doing too much fiber. There's just balance in what I'm doing because that's how the body works. Like every science paper about any pathology you will ever read uses the word homeostasis. Okay. That's a word for balance. And then somewhere in there it says loss of homeostasis leads to, okay? So what you find is that we have this belief that things are good and other things are bad, but really the way to think of it is a meter. Like here's good, this is not good, this is not good over here. In the middle is kind of good, too little is not good, too much. And you'll find that's true of almost anything. Too little of a thing is usually not good. Too much of a thing is usually not good. We can make that case for antioxidants. Somewhat known is oxidative stress. People kind of get that. Like, oh, you get oxidative stress, too many free radicals. What's almost not known at all is reductive stress. Like nobody knows. What is that? Reductive stress. Well, it's been there the whole time. Reductive stress is too much of a good thing. Reductive stress is too much antioxidant activity, too much reductive activity, and it's equally as bad as oxidative stress. So the idea that oxidative stress is bad, antioxidants are good, no, that's not true. It's sort of being in the middle is good, too little is bad, too much is bad, okay? And so the same is true of Akkermansia. You can have too much through extreme practices, and it's just by looking at the extremes, you can kind of stick your finger in the wind. But with respect to metabolism and bacteria, so when we look at both Akkermansia and Bifidobacteria, you find that there's a number of things that both of them do that help human metabolism. One of them has to do with gene expression. And so you'll find that key species of Bifidobacteria activate human genes that are involved with longevity, with being lean. I talk about the example of ANGLP4 or fasting-induced adipose factor, which is a protein that helps fat loss that Bifidobacteria actually secrete as a metabolite. But they also have a lot of effects on other things. They affect bile acid secretion, and that affects insulin sensitivity and a whole bunch of other things. Akkermansia also seems to affect a number of things. Most notably, it seems to contract the surface area of the gut. So it seems to reduce net calories absorbed. So you actually absorb fewer calories when Akkermansia is sort of abundant in the gut versus when you don't have any. There's some line of evidence with respect to obesity looking at like just Akkermansia alone seems to solve the problem. And it's because you're harvesting way too many calories from the diet. So all that to say, kind of long-winded there, but very specific bacteria work in conjunction with the human genome. It's called the three genomes. So you've got the human genome, the bacterial genome, the mitochondrial genome. And certain bacteria kind of create this trifecta. They talk and they activate and they cause genes to express. And at the top of the list are Akkermansia and Bifidobacteria.
Right. So So let's say you want the three to have this, this wonderful conversation where everything sort of falls into place and you can pursue optimal health and longevity and better body composition. But how do you
One of
know
the
that
ways
they're
is your
having a
energy level.
conversation, a productive conversation?
So when your energy level is really good, it's a very good indicator. And both in the immunity code and then in my immune centric fat loss course, I have these little things you can do in there to drive commensal bacteria, and they work very well for most people. Like you do these little tests to spin up bacteria, and not everybody, but quite a few people, the majority, report like skyrocketing energy levels, and it's from all the B vitamin production in the gut when you spin these bacteria up. So energy levels are definitely an indicator. Smell of your poop is another big one. So when your poop smells toxic, your gut's probably toxic. when your poop smells kind of neutral, then your gut's probably in much better shape.
So interestingly, one of my follow-up questions here was I wanted to get your take on some of these,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
tests like, the Biome and then there's like seed and such. So right now I'm actually in the midst of
Mm-hmm.
doing something. I'm messing
Mm-hmm.
around with Biome for the second time. They sent me a free kit and I'm doing all that,
Mm-hmm.
doing going through the whole process. And I have honestly found that as of the past few months, I've had some
Mm-hmm.
pretty distinct gut issues. So, and even on
Mm-hmm.
Viome, it
Mm-hmm.
says that I'm like B vitamin
Mm-hmm.
depleted, and I make sure to get a lot of, B vitamins in my diet. And then, the smell, of course, has changed. I'm sure you can imagine on which end of the spectrum that's gone. And so I'm having some of these issues, and it's interesting. Viome said that they have all these supplement recommendations after you get the testing done, and so they actually I think are sending me
Mm-hmm.
all these B
Mm-hmm.
vitamin supplements. But with what you just told me,
Mm-hmm.
there's habits that I can enable to improve the gut microbiome so that it can produce more of these B vitamins because I do get a lot of my diet already. So it's not like supplementing more will help. It's like
Yeah.
what can I do
So
from a habitual
it's a
perspective?
very, very important question. I tend to be, very much in the camp of food can do most of the heavy lifting for us, and then supplements are supplemental. And I'm a supplement junkie. Okay, I love supplements, but food can do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So I like to kind of try an approach where you know you give food a chance to work, and very often what's missing in the equation with food is you've only factored in what you're eating. It's a question of what, like what is it, what's the thing, but you've left out the how and you've left out the when, and when and how are really really important, really important. I have all these little experiments that people can put themselves through, and you can just kind of eat these foods in this sequence and then just test it for yourself, and very often the outcomes are very very positive. Like people will report, oh my gosh, my energy is really really high, since doing this. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes someone's got some issue, and sometimes maybe you need something supplemental. Maybe you have a methylation issue. Maybe, who knows. So, but I like to kind of start with food and just see if you can get where you want to go with food, and then see where supplements fit in from there. So it's not to say that there isn't a place. I think probably the most interesting space that we're going to be coming up on here in the next few years in the post-peptide era is going to be the strategic use of single strains of bacteria for specific issues. My coaches have seen really amazing results using single strains for issues like, picket, but that's going to be an area that's going to be really hot. I'm personally not a regular user of probiotics, just because I prefer to let food do the heavy lifting. Every now and then I'll use something selectively if I need it, like if I got sick, if it was COVID or something, post-COVID, I might have some Bifidobacteria strains I add in and a few other things. But I tend to let food do a lot of the work. So I haven't caught up with Viome or Seed, in a while. I don't know what their latest stuff is, so it's probably not fair to comment on that.
Right. Well, they're sending me like a combined like 44 supplements and like 9 strains of bacteria. So I imagine that one of those strains could perhaps help me with the B vitamin turnover and such. I'd say that the biggest shift that's happened in my life as of the past few months dealing with these symptoms is just the knowledge that I'll be moving across the world within the next couple of weeks. And I think that the underlying
Oh yeah, where
stress
are you
of
moving to?
that has taken its toll on my gut microbiome. I'm going to be moving. First, I'm going to be going
Uh-huh.
from, I'm in Miami now. I'm going to be going to New York for a couple months, and then I'll be primarily
Really,
based in Uruguay,
really. What's up with
and
that? Why
yeah,
are you
in
bugging out?
Punta del Este. Yeah,
Disaster planning?
yeah. So Believe it or not. No, no, no. So I actually just actually spoke about this on my 50th episode. So if anyone wants to maybe take a deep dive on what's happening, you can tune into that one. But between you and me, what's happening is I was essentially hired as a wellness coach by the head of a venture capital firm. So, very wealthy family, and we're going to be, my girlfriend and I are going to be traveling with them as wellness coaches. They're outsourcing all their wellness decisions to us. So anything from nutrition and fitness to finding the best specialists in the world to help take care of them, to, programming meals with their private chefs and such. So we're going out there with them, and we're pretty much on an on-call basis, but otherwise I'm still going to be doing the podcast, all the content creation, still have clients that I
Yeah.
work with remotely and such. So it's a really cool opportunity, but so much freedom
What a
tied into
blast.
it, opening so many doors and just getting to do what I love
That's
all
so
at once.
cool.
And it's taking me all over the world. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's a really cool opportunity. Yeah, it's we're really excited, but uprooting our lives here in Miami, and we have our families here, our friends. It's tough. I like to imagine that I'm really good at handling this kind of thing, this kind of stress, but I know that it's stressing me.
For sure.
And I think
Yeah.
that
Well,
that's where a lot of the
we'll miss you at
symptoms
the
are coming into
crash.
play. Well, in this case, is there a particular approach that you would take to this kind of stress from a gut microbiome perspective? Just knowing that stress can diminish gut microbiome diversity, that it can almost snoop the gut microbiome in some ways. What would you recommend as a sort of
Yeah.
preventative
I would
mechanism or even
start with,
interventional?
there's kind of a layer of things you would do. The first thing I would probably start with is dosing some key aminos. So I would dose arginine, glycine, tryptophan.
What about essential amino acids? Because I take the Keon essential
Uh,
aminos like
well,
most every day.
so I would, and those are great. I love Ben stuff. Since you're asking me a gut specific question, I'm giving you a gut specific answer, which is you need arginine, glutamine, tryptophan,
Right.
glycine. You need those, and probably serine. Okay, so I would probably start with dosing those. The next thing I would look at would be probably throwing in some BB536. No, 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 no. BB536
BB536,
is
is that a peptide?
it's a Bifidobacteria strain. Yeah, it's kind of like the Swiss
Or is it a
Army
strain?
knife. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of strains.
Okay.
So it's kind of like your first go-to for a lot of different issues. And the way I like to do that is I like to break the capsules open, put them in yogurt, mix it up really good, and then take it as a food source. So it's loaded with all the glycomacropeptides and all the milk sugars and all that stuff. And do that for a few weeks, like 2 weeks. Probably that's what I would do to start with, and see how you feel. If you haven't done the immunity code protocols, I would do those. I would do the HMO.
I'm gonna dig into your book uh, this week. I'm gonna dig into that, and I'd love to have you
Yeah, yeah,
not to conclude the podcast here because I want to
yeah,
continue to pick your brain for while I've got you.
yeah.
But I definitely want to do a follow
We'll
up
do it.
with you a
Yeah,
couple weeks
actually
from
that
now
would be
once I'm
good.
done digging
Probably
into your
go
book.
do that stuff. Come back, and then we'll talk. Yeah, do that. Do the reds, the HMOs,
Cool.
and the apple peel, or in your case, probably apple peel powder would be better for you. Yeah, do those for sure, along with those other things. Yeah, that's what I would do. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
if you don't mind, I'd like to shift gears again, and I want to talk a little bit about,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep.
this young muscle, how you build it. The first time that I ever heard of you was on one of Ben Greenfield's podcasts, and I was taking a walk. My parents live in an area where there's a lot of land, large, yeah, properties and long roads and such. It's a great place to go road cycling or to go walking. I was walking on this long stretch of road, and as soon as you said, you want to do the sprints and then the deadlifts, it's like you hunted down the prey, now you're taking it home. I immediately started sprinting in my Earth Runners. And I was fast, and I started sprinting like at full speed. I even took a selfie. If you go to our
Uh-huh.
Instagram DMs, you'll notice the first message between you and I. It's like I'm some random dude is just tagging on his story, like in the rain,
That's
saying,
awesome.
"Hey, just sprinted," listening to the podcast. You know, so and then I got home, did some deadlifts, and then I had my first meal. So if you can tell us a little bit
Hmm.
about why I did that,
Hmm.
why I may have been motivated to do that, if you can, you
Hmm.
know, maybe motivate whoever's tuning in now to do the same.
Yeah. Well,
What can be said
so
about young muscle and how to build it?
as we age, this is kind of a big, deep conversation. I'll try and keep it succinct, but energy is the foundational currency of the body. And when you dive into the, kind of the cellular milieu, and you ask, what does it take to get this particular thing done? Whether it's assemble a protein or move something somewhere, it takes ATP. You need energy to move things. Okay, so the body's ability to produce energy is essential to life itself. We need to produce our own body weight in ATP every day, and you're certainly not eating that. You're eating maybe a pound or two of food a day, maybe, but you're making whatever, 170, 200 pounds of ATP every single day. Okay. That's how important energy is. Energy is the currency of life. The body's ability to produce energy depends a lot on the musculature because it's the primary storehouse of the mitochondria. And when you break the mitochondria down and you dig into them, they're not what we think they are. They're not these little jelly beans we think they are. They're vastly different from that. They're these long tubules. They interconnect. They cross cells. They form networks. They essentially have a communication layer that's based on light within them. They have a communication layer that's based on chemistry. So they have two different stacks of communication layers going on. They produce light. They're very, very important. But one of the key aspects of them is complex 5, which is an actual engine. And complex 5 is sort of like, the workhorse of producing a lot of the ATP that the body needs. And so as we begin to age out and the muscles wither, then, you start to see essentially this winding down of the ability to produce energy by virtue of the mitochondria going down and all this stuff. So long story short, that brings us to when we look at as the body's aging out, losing muscle and losing muscle's ability to create energy is a huge, huge deal. Where's the problem? Well, one of the places the problem is in fast twitch fibers. You're preserving the slow twitch fibers as you age. Okay, so that's why you can still get big. You can still, push heavy weights, but you're losing the fast twitch fibers. That's why you can't run fast anymore as you get older. Okay, and so when we look at sprinting, among every possible exercise, what's sort of an interesting anecdote is that it's the only exercise tied to survival. Like, you pretty much all mammals have to be able to do that pretty well. Like you have to be able to sprint pretty well, and if you don't, you're probably going to die. So the ability to marshal a bunch of sudden power output at a peak level is tied to survival. And what I found is that anything that taps into survival confers a lot of benefit to the body. So what sprinting does, just as a foundational exercise, is you're pretty much hitting most of the mitochondria in the musculature. You're asking them to do something, to produce work, to produce energy, and it's hitting everything all at once. And it's tapping into multiple forms of respiration. So, you're tapping into glycolysis and producing pyruvate, producing lactate, producing, ATP. It's tapping into all the body's energy production. One of the things about sprinting that I think is unique is that it has a unique place. It has a unique place in history and a unique place in the pantheon of exercise, so that I've just found sprinting yields tremendous benefits for keeping the body sort of youthful. As you age, it's really a day-by-day proposition. It's kind of like holding a dagger. If you let go for a second, the thing's going to drop. And so you just kind of have to keep hold of it. What you'll find is that you can work yourself up into a very youthful athletic state. I'm over 50 and, I've managed to keep that. But if you let go, even for a week, you got to go to the back of the line. Okay. So, you have to start all over. It's crazy. And you age a little bit every day. So what sprinting does is it really provides a ton of reward for relatively little effort. I'll go and do, just some 50, 100-meter sprints, and I don't even do that many at a time. I'll do maybe, 4, something like that. And then I'll go back and do them maybe a little bit later in the day. And what I find is that my energy is through the roof. Like if it's later in the day and my energy's low, I'll just go do some sprints, and it's like I feel like I'm 20 again. I'm brand new. Why? Why is that? It's because when you get into the cellular level, you look at ATP production, look at action in the mitochondria, you're stoking the youth fire, so to speak, by doing that. So sprinting has had a place in my whole life because it's the foundational exercise. And since the immunity code has come out, it's really caught on. Like like kind of everybody's getting into it now. There was some PhD dude who tried to like, swipe my no warm up sprinting stuff like it was his. And, I'm seeing a lot of podcasts now. It's having a renaissance, which is really cool because it's the one exercise that keeps the body youthful. And you can use it as a measure. Like people who can sprint tend to be pretty young and athletic, even if they're older. People who can't, I don't care what you look like, your athletic ability tends to go with it. So it's an AMP-K activator. It stimulates the mitochondria. It stimulates fast twitch muscle. It stimulates all the things you're going to lose with age. And so it's a good thing to stay on top of. But the trick is you have to build up to it. You can't start. Like, especially as you get over 35 and 40, you got to give yourself 2, 3, 4, 5 months to build up to sprinting. You have to start slow and just baby step your way up.
So if we can conclude with the first law of thermodynamics, because I see people online, some of these really prominent, PhDs in the world of nutrition and fitness, they say, hey, it's as simple as calories in, calories out. It's not about fasting or autophagy. Autophagy happens as long as you have more calories out versus calories in. You're in deficit, like you get the same benefits, and it's all calories in, calories out, and I think. And I'm not gonna, we'll keep names out of this, but I think it's definitely the folks who are more like the bodybuilding realm, and they have more of the sort of bias towards that first law of thermodynamics being like the end all be all. And some of these folks, again, not saying names, but they're all about tracking your macros. You gotta track your macros to get in your best shape and live your longest, healthiest life. So what can be said about the first law of thermodynamics?
They don't understand it. That's what they haven't studied the first law. Okay, so here's the problem with that. The first law of thermodynamics predicts you can have a non-zero energy balance and the mass of the system stays the same. And it also predicts a non-zero energy balance, and you can't. So let me give you an analogy here, okay, to explain it. Let's take so conservation of energy. Let's take a cylinder, okay. Think of a cylinder like a piston, okay, and it's got a gas in it, okay. We inject energy into the system, okay. Think calories. We put calories into the system. What does the gas do? The gas expands, right? Has the mass changed? No, not a bit, right? Not a bit. So the opposite's true. We could take energy out of the system. What's that? That's a caloric deficit, right? What happens to the mass? Does it change? No, the mass is the same. The gas can expand, but the mass hasn't changed, okay? That is exactly what the first law of thermodynamics predicts. It predicts that you can have a non-zero energy balance and the mass stays the same. So translated into nutrition, what that means is that you could be at a caloric deficit and lose no mass. Conversely, you could be at a caloric excess and gain no mass. That's what the first law of thermodynamics predicts, 100%. So anybody that's preaching that, and you go back and look at the first law of thermodynamics, there are some really interesting new papers on this subject that seem to suggest that that whole school of thought got it wrong, and that it's probably more to do with the second law of thermodynamics, with conservation of mass. And there's some interesting arguments about rates of fat oxidation versus rates of carbohydrate oxidation, and that these two can shift, and so that you can have sort of an increase in a rate of fat oxidation, a lower rate of carbohydrate oxidation. And this explains a lot of things. So that whole first law of thermodynamics, conservation of energy, it's pretty much like not even based on how the first law of thermodynamics works. What I would say anecdotally is, if you've ever worked with real populations of people, and I've worked with tens of thousands, like you can go to my transcend.fit page, pull up a video of the city of Phoenix, and you know what you'll see? You will see thousands of people in a room, okay? And I can tell you, you could put them on caloric deficit. You can put them on deficits till the cows come home and they won't drop weight. Anybody who's ever worked with populations like that will tell you that. You can create massive caloric deficits and they won't lose weight. Very often what happens is you put them on more calories and that's when they start dropping weight. Calories are foundational. They're extremely important. Sometimes they're the only thing. Sometimes they're the only thing that'll solve the problem. But very often as not, what I see is, particularly with you get with older populations and you get with like people who are really heavy, there's a whole bunch of other things that factor into the equation. A whole bunch of other things. I mean, I've personally seen tons of people put on massive caloric deficits and they can't drop a pound. Okay. And that's exactly what the first law of thermodynamics predicts.
You know, first of all, thank you for taking us through that. I want to add, if you take something like, a calorie is a calorie and a gram of this is a gram of in excess, a gram of uranium, like 1 gram of uranium, it's got about 18 million calories. So if you were to consume according to these folks who are so obsessive about calories in, calories out, this and that, if you were to consume 1 gram of uranium, you'd gain about 5,142.857 pounds.
Yeah.
It's like what are you talking about? I
would
had
just
1
say,
gram
like,
of
when you
uranium.
hear
You know what I
that,
mean?
like, I would just say you've never worked with real
So
populations. You worked with bodybuilders,
anyway,
and that's who you're working. And that stuff works. It works well on bodybuilders. But when you get into real populations, people with insulin resistance, people with, like obesity and all kinds of things, caloric deficits very often just don't do any good. It's not to say that they don't. Again, sometimes they're the only thing that'll solve the problem, but just as often as not, there's so many other variables in play. You've got to get inflammation down, inflammation in the body fat. You got to get the gut working. There's all kinds of things that come into play to get the needle to move. And I'm not, that's just reality of it. So,
hey, Joel, what an honor, what a pleasure to have you. What an incredible episode. Record for the longest episode and definitely the densest for all the right reasons. And I can't wait to dig into this with my audience. We'll actually also be creating an article that goes into all these key points. So we'll make sure to link to everything in the show notes. We'll link to all of your websites and your books and such. And yeah, I mean,
thank you.
beyond that,
Yeah, this was
thank you
fun.
so
We'll do
much
it
for your
again. This
time
is
and for your
this is good
passion
stuff. So,
and for your ideas.
yeah, you're my first.
Sweet. Awesome.